Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes, and it's Good Friday. Have a good afternoon. I hope you enjoy today's presentation. We are reading London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins. We are nearly halfway through this remarkable book, which was published in 1945, just at the end of the Second World War. And it was based in 1938, just before the Second World War. We're in book 3, Love in a Basement, which is the title of this book within the novel, and it's chapter 33. We've got a couple of minutes to go before it's 4 o'clock here, so we'll give people a chance to come along. But hello to the lovely Julia, to TurboStream, to Sensible Paul, who says he forgot it was Good Friday and went to pick up his prescription. Is the chemist not open on a Friday then, on a Good Friday? Surely chemist is open. Davey Vad says, howdy folks. TurboStream says, oh dear. Nice to see you, Zom Coco, Toolpodge Rog, Billabong O'Neill, and Audrey Forbes Hamilton, and Jen Coley, and Anne H. Very nice of you all to come along. Looking forward to the next bit. It is warm, but there's a cold wind, and I got a bit cold, so I've had to put a jacket on over my jumpers. Sorry about that. That is the way it is. We're coming up to 4 o'clock, so we will crack on. Lee Lawson's arrived. Hello, cup of tea and gluten-free hot cross bun for me. And I have a gluten-full cup of cheap and nasty coffee. Well, it's not nasty, it's quite nice, but it is on special offer, so it was cheap. Just adjusting my volume. Philip, Hammond and Mary, good afternoon. Richard and lovely Julia and everybody, there we are. We've almost got a full complement, so we'll crack on. It's 4 o'clock now, so off we go. Chapter 33. Adjust my glasses so I can actually see the words. Anyone with half an eye could have seen that Doreen's and Doris's studio arrangement couldn't last forever, and it didn't. They had just had their first row, and it was a big one. It was also their last. They had both known each other for some time. They'd both known, rather, for some time that it was coming. All the same, when it broke, it was out of a clear sky. The row divided itself neatly into two parts. The first part took place between 7:15 and 8 o'clock p.m. The second, roughly 2.5 hours later, and finished up about 11. There had been a slight disagreement at breakfast because Doreen took all the milk, but that affair had entirely blown over. They had ridden down together in the bus afterwards, in that almost arm-in-arm intimacy that sharing a double seat imposes. Lunch, too, was perfectly normal, and everything passed off quietly until Doreen announced that Mr. Purkis had phoned her up and that she had invited him round that evening. Doris didn't like Mr. Purkis and told Doreen so. She said that she would go out somewhere, to the flicks, probably. But now that Doris had made the suggestion, Doreen wouldn't hear of it, simply wouldn't hear of it. Oh, you can't, she said hurriedly. You really can't. Not tonight. You know how he is about me. He goes absolutely crazy if we're alone for a moment. I never have asked him if... I'd never have asked him if I hadn't been sure you'd be here. So it was finally agreed. Doris would be there to protect Doreen from the advances of the passionate Mr. Purkis, and on the way home they went to the delicatessen shop and bought a tin of mushroom soup, some ham, and a carton of potato salad with which to help assuage this elderly satyr in a fawn suit. Doreen protested vigorously that it wasn't right that Doris should pay for anything, as Mr. Purkis was her friend, really. But, she pointed out, Mr. Purkis was sure to bring something with him. And, as they all had, and as they'll all have some of it, it would come to the same thing in the end, wouldn't it? It was while she was laying, it's going to be one of those days, I'm afraid, I can see that coming. It was while she was laying the table that Dollis? Who's Dollis? Dollis sneaked in by the back door. Hang on, this eye's weeping now. Let's have another slurp of coffee, maybe that'll do it. Oh, lovely, jubbly. Where was I? It was while she was laying the table that Doris remarked that she wished she'd thought of it and that she'd invited Bill to come along too. The remark annoyed Doreen, who was in the small cubicle-like bedroom making up her face. Bill, she pointed out, was her friend, not Doris's, and if she wanted Bill, she was perfectly capable of inviting him herself. Indeed, if it hadn't been for her, she went on, Doris would never have met him. It was because this was true, and because of the obligation that it implied, that Doris resented it so much. She slammed down the butter dish that she'd been holding and addressed the empty doorway in the corner. Well, anyway, he's more my friend now than he is yours, she answered defiantly. As soon as she said it, Doreen appeared. She was smoking a cigarette and wearing an old flowered dressing gown. Her face glistened with cold cream, and her hair was gathered up in a red silk handkerchief. On each cheek a small disc of rouge that had not yet been rubbed in burned fiercely. Altogether she looked like something large and sticky from the back row of a ballet. "Listen, my pet," she said, "I don't like little girls who go about stealing other girls' friends." "I didn't steal him," Doris retorted. "Well, that's all right then," Doris told her, smiling in a deliberately theatrical sort of way through the cold cream. It's only just that I'm warning you." Doris turned her back on her and went through into the absurdly tiny kitchen. It might still have been all right if Doreen had left it at that, but instead of going back into the bedroom and doing something constructive with her face, she followed Doris into the kitchen. And even when they were on best terms, there wasn't really room for two of them in there at once. And tonight it seemed simply suffocating. "Really, my pet," Doreen said, I can't bear to see you making a fool of you like this. If you've gone and fallen for Bill in a big way, you'd better watch your step. He just isn't your type." Doris was standing back from Doreen, right up against the little sink, as she said it. It was the first time that she had ever found Doreen repulsive. But now, everything about her, her shiny, dolled-up face, the cigarette hanging out of the corner of her mouth, the smeary, wallpapered, flowered dressing gown, the habit of calling other people her pet, it all repelled her. "And how do you know whether he's my type or not, might I ask?" Everything about the row was proceeding along perfectly classical lines. Doris had now reached the stage of extreme formality. As for Doreen, she remained more frankly rude. "Because I know you better than he does, my lamb," she answered. "Or don't I?" "Well, what do you mean by that, pray?" Doreen smiled her carefully calculated smile again, and she held on to it all the time she was speaking. "You surely can't want me to actually say it," she said. "You must know." She paused. "Bill comes from such a different sort of house, a different home." "Well, what's wrong with my home?" "Oh, nothing, darling," Doreen assured her, still smiling. "Nothing. If you can't see what I mean, I can't explain it to you. It only just proves what I'm saying." She paused again. "Not that I mind, of course. I understand." "I think you're perfectly horrid." Doreen came a step nearer. The smile had gone by now. "Don't be rude, cherub," she said. "That would be so common." She turned her back on Doris as she said it, and made her way back to the bedroom. She hadn't meant to have a row with Doris. It had just turned out that way. Her nerves were jangling anyhow. They had been all day. If there were any of Doris's aspirins left, she'd take a couple. Not that aspirins were really what she wanted. They took away the headache, but they left you feeling so flat and stupid. It was a drink she needed. But until Mr. Purkis arrived, there was only orange squash and lime juice in the flat. Oh, God, she remembered suddenly. I'll have to make it up with Doris before Mr. Purkis arrives. Otherwise it'll be just too awful. She was thus quite unprepared for what happened. She hadn't reached the bedroom door by the time Doris caught up with her. If you think I'm common, she said, let me tell you what you are. You're just a greedy manhunter. You'd go after anything, even after Mr. Purkis. You haven't the slightest self-respect where a man's concerned. Oh, no, you're not common, of course not. And let me tell you something else as well. You're lazy, bone lazy. You don't do anything in this flat. If I left it the way you do, you couldn't have any of your wonderful boyfriends here because it would be a pigsty. It was at that point that Mr. Purkis arrived, and as Doreen couldn't possibly see him, it was Doris who had to let him in. She sat him down in the easy chair and gave him the evening paper and left him. It was nearly half an hour before the girls came through to him, and it didn't make the matters any easier that they weren't on speaking terms. Doreen had spent the first 15 minutes crying, and she still was shaky and on the edge. But Mr. Purkis didn't seem to notice. He was too much preoccupied with being delightful. He had brought gin and roses, and he kept referring to them as his little offering. But in his manner of making the presentations, he blundered. Instead of simply dumping the things down on the table and then standing well back, he gave them each the presents in person. It was the gin he gave to Doreen, and the roses he gave to Doris. A picture, he said, as he watched her holding them. A perfect picture. You belong to each other, you and the roses. There was nothing about the remark that need have annoyed Doreen. It was simply Mr. Purkis's way of talking, and she would much rather have had the gin, but she had only just recovered from the violent fit of wanting to commit suicide, and was in a mood when quite little things upset her. At the thought that Mr. Purkis's compliments were being directed at Doris, she was ready to start howling any moment. And Mr. Purkis, not conscious that he was being anything other than a very charming success, went on untactfully. He admired Doris's earrings. Then, not content with that, he told Doreen that, poor dear child, she looked tired. He wished, he said, that he could tear himself away from the office, if only for a long weekend, just to take her to the sea somewhere and bring back the colour to her cheeks. He mentioned 3 times in all that she was looking worn out. And, or so it was only that Doreen, or was it only that Doreen was imagining it, he was paying particular attention to Doris. He gave her his glass of gin and lime because he said the glass, they were very old glasses in the flat, matched her dress. And then, turning smilingly to Doreen, he assured her that it was wicked, absolutely wicked, the way young girls were worked in the office these days. The proper place for girls, he said, was in gardens gathering flowers. Considering his smallness, he was just a little grasshopper of a man. He made a surprisingly good meal out of the mushroom soup and cold ham, and he talked food as he ate it. He remembered other delicious meals that he'd eaten on the continent, and the only other thing that seemed wrong about them in retrospect was that the girls had not been there to eat them with him. To make up for it, he began planning other meals in London. When Doreen said that she adored oysters and didn't want the rest of the meal, sorry, I'm not reading very well. I'm struggling today. Hang on, slurp of coffee. When Doreen said that she adored oysters and didn't mind what the rest of the meal was like, so long as there was oysters, Mr. Perkis promised to take them to Prunia's. Then, not wishing to miss an opportunity of being skittish, he explained that he would take Doris another time, adding that no gentleman in his position could afford to be seen with two pretty girls at the same time. It was another piece of untactfulness, and it hurt Doreen terribly. She saw how right she had been in what she had said. Doris was stealing her boyfriends, stealing them one after another. But she tried to pretend that she hadn't noticed anything. She just fixed a social smile on her face and went on sipping her drink as though she were enjoying herself. Then Bill came. They didn't hear him coming up the iron staircase because he was wearing crepe rubber shoes. But they heard him all right as soon as he got up on the veranda, and that was because he fell against one of the little brightly painted tubs that Doreen had placed there. It went careering all over the place, with Bill after it. And apart from arriving at an awkward moment, just as the meal was nearly over, Bill was poor company. He was both loving and despondent. His finals were in the morning, and the examination board of the faculty would decide whether he really should be allowed to become a doctor or not. At the moment, he rather feared not. Until half an hour ago, he had resolved to spend the evening quietly in his room in an orgy of last-minute revision. He had decided to check up on everything: the bones of the ear, the nervous system, the symptoms of scarlet fever, the classification of blood groups, the sulfonamide reactions, materia medica, morphology, anaesthetics, pathology, midwifery, the whole bag of tricks, in fact. 5 years' medicine packed into a single desperate evening's reading. Then, quite suddenly, just as he was getting down to things, he realised that he must simply see Doris. Stopping abruptly in the middle of a cardiac stimulant abuse of, he got up from his chair and came. It was Mr. Perkis's gin that helped to revive him. He poured him out a long, solemn drink and felt better. Under the influence of it, he became genial and silly. He began testing everybody's reflexes, including his own, and was delighted to discover that Doreen was on the top of the list and Mr. Perkis was at the bottom. Bill kept hitting Mr. Perkis's knee over and over again, but nothing happened. Mr. Perkis had simply no reflexes at all. Perhaps that's why he seemed to dislike the whole experiment. But what was far worse than Bill's clottishness was the way he behaved towards Doris. He went across and sat on the arm of her chair, leaving Doreen alone on the divan, and Mr. Perkis perched on the colour wicker sit-easy that creaked under his weight. Doreen watched him with tears starting in her eyes. Somehow Mr. Perkis, absolute darling though he was, looked so small and desiccated besides Bill. And because Doris looked so happy and comfortable, and because Doreen herself felt so miserable and out of it, she simply had to say something. "Tell Monty about what's happened to Percy," she said. "He's been so interested in him ever since that night he came here." Doris shook her head. "I'll tell him another time," she replied. "Oh, but you must," Doreen went on. "It's so tremendously exciting. Monty adores crime." Mr. Perkis leant forward and raised his little marmoset face pleadingly. "Please, please, tell me," he said. Such an intriguing young man. I've never met anyone quite like him before." "Some other time," Doris repeated. It annoyed Doreen that Doris was behaving in this cold, off-hand manner to Mr. Purkis, but that was not surprising. Everything about Doris annoyed Doreen tonight. Her head was swimming. That was Bill's fault. She had started drinking all over again when he came, and she had told herself, even before then, that it was time for her to stop. "What a long time ago it seems when I first met Percy," she said. "It was over at Kennington." She paused. "Do you remember it, my pet? It was the night the gas went off at supper because your father had forgotten to put the shilling in." "I remember," Doris answered. Her voice was dangerously calm and level as she said it. Doreen continued to lie there, staring up at the ceiling. Then she turned to Mr. Purkis. "You'd never have thought to look at him," she went on, "but he's just been arrested for stealing cars. It was in the paper. You wouldn't have guessed Doreen had friends like that, would you?" Mr. Purkis raised his fair, almost invisible eyebrows. "Well, well," said Mr. Purkis, "how remarkable." He leaned across and smiled charmingly at Doris. "I shall hear next. You've got a girl bandit yourself, just like in the moving pictures." As he spoke, he extended the first finger of both hands and gave a genteel imitation of someone firing off two revolvers simultaneously. But this was just one more piece of untactfulness in the course of this deplorable evening, for it didn't amuse Doris in the least. "I think you're being perfectly horrible," she said. "You seem to forget that Percy's in prison." As she said it, she saw Percy very plainly. He was in his purple suit and his yellow shoes, and he was sitting beside her in the Toledo, a foolish, dreamy look on his face. He was eating ice cream out of one of those threepenny cups and listening to the organ. The effect of Doris's remark was to make Mr. Purkis withdraw simply into himself like a snail that has had its horns touched. If there was one thing that he couldn't bear, it was for a young lady to think him horrible. He drew in his breath with a small sucking sound and said nothing. It was Doreen who replied for him. She threw out a cloud of cigarette smoke and addressed the ceiling. "It's all my fault," she said. "I ought to have remembered. They meant a lot to each other. Once." She dropped her face for a moment, so she was regarding Doris out of the corner of her eye. "You weren't actually engaged to him or anything, were you?" she asked. Doris sat up very straight. "You know I wasn't. There was never anything like that." Doreen didn't move. She was lying back on her cushions, her arms folded behind her head. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I quite thought there was," she said. "You were always talking about him, and then when he dropped in that night, everything seemed so natural." "Don't be silly," said Doris. It was really a very mild little answer, but Doreen's state was dangerous. She'd been called silly in front of other people. "How was I to know he was just another of your boyfriends?" she retorted. "I don't have any boyfriends," Doris said, sitting bolt upright now. Doreen smiled. It began the sort of a prolonged smile, but it became a slurred and untidy laugh that, for some reason, she couldn't stop. The sound of it alarmed her. Could it possibly be, she wondered, that she really had drunk too much of Monty Purkis's gin? "That isn't what you told me earlier," she said. Doris got up and came over to her. "I didn't tell you anything," she said. I don't know why, but you're trying to be beastly. I think you're loathsome." Doreen sat up abruptly. Her head was swimming. "When I want a lesson in manners from you, I shall ask for it," she answered. "Just because your Percy's been put in prison, you needn't go about trying to get someone else." The words she said The words, as she said them, sounded perfectly dreadful. They astonished her. But she'd been unable to stop saying them. They were what she'd been keeping at the back of her mind, and suddenly they'd just come out pouring. Then, to her further astonishment, she found that she wasn't saying them to Doris any longer. Doris had left and gone through into her bedroom. She was speaking to herself. She got up hurriedly and followed her. Bill and Mr. Purkis exchanged glances. "What a sad affair," Mr. Purkis said, shaking his head nervously. "I'm afraid our little Doreen isn't quite herself tonight." Bill didn't say anything. He went and leant up against the painted windowsill on the far wall. He wanted to have a private word with Doris, and then another private word with Doreen afterwards. He was still wondering how he could contrive it when Doris appeared again. She was carrying a suitcase, and she went straight past him to the front door without speaking. As she passed him, Bill saw that she was crying. "What's happening?" he said. "Where are you going?" But she didn't answer, and even if she'd answered it would have been difficult to hear her, because Doreen was apologising at the top of her voice from the bedroom. She would kill herself, she kept saying, if Doris went. And Mr. Purkis was the only silent one. He remained perched up in the wicker sit-easy, a frightful look on his face, trying to appear oblivious of the commotion that was going on all around him. As Doris slammed the front door behind her, Bill snatched up his hat and, without saying goodbye to anyone, jerked the door open again and followed her. It was late now. Really late. After midnight, in fact. Across the table with all the textbooks lying on it, Bill and Doris sat looking at each other. "Feel better?" Bill was asking. He had just poured out the last of the beer and had insisted that Doris should drink it. "Beer's best," he said. And Doris had drunk it, and she didn't like beer, and she felt a little sick at the moment, but she nodded dutifully. You'll feel better still in the morning," Bill told her. "I ought to go now," she said slowly. But Bill wouldn't hear of it. "We've had all that out before," he said firmly. "You can't go home at this time. Just upset 'em. You have the bed, and I'll take the couch." He sat there looking at her for a moment, as though turning something in his mind, and then he picked up his cherry pipe in the corner and began filling it. "In any case, I've got some reading to do." On the table, the whole unfamiliar theory of modern medicine lay there to be absorbed. Doris, however, was apparently thinking of something else. "Do you think Doreen will be all right?" Doris asked suddenly. "She won't kill herself or anything?" Bill looked up again. "At this moment," he answered, "Doreen is probably making Mr. Purkis a very happy man." He paused. "Like me to go while you get into bed?" he asked. "Have to be a bit quiet because the landlady's one of the old-fashioned sort." "That's all right," Doris answered. "I'm just going to lie down as I am." She kicked off her shoes and stretched out onto the bed. There she lay, staring up at the ceiling. It was not a particularly bright and comely ceiling, but Bill's shadow from the reading lamp on the table beside him spread itself over her, in fact. It was larger than life and somehow comforting. After a while, Bill turned on her. "Like the light out?" "When you're ready," she answered. "Ready now," he told her. In the darkness, the room seemed smaller, and as it contracted, it grew more intimate. Through the faint light entering through the window, Doris saw Bill arranging the cushions on the couch for a pillow. Then he drew up a chair for his legs. He was very businesslike about it, and had the air of a man who'd been sleeping on couches all his life. "Good night," he said. "Good night," Doris answered. They lay there without speaking. One of the churches in Hampstead struck one. "You still awake?" Bill asked. "I'm awake." "So am I. I'm lonely." Ding dong. Chapter 34, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about my somewhat stifled reading today. I don't know why. Did it have a casino? I don't know. May have done. As cells go, it was one of the more comfortable ones. There were 2 chairs as well as a table. There was a bed in the corner. The bed was 2 foot 6 inches wide and 6 foot long exactly. It was made up on the simple principle of spreading a very thin straw palliasse over a shelf of very thick boards. At the foot of the bed were 2 rough blankets and a pillow, thin like a mattress and stuffed with the same creaky straw. Altogether, it was the kind of bed to be slept on rather than lingered in. Over the edge of the bed, and so high that even standing on the bed itself you couldn't look out, was the window. 6 massive metal bars, like park rails, ran up and down across its width, and there was a wire mesh stretched across the bars so that the birds couldn't fly in and things couldn't be thrown out. It was not the bars alone that made the window depressing. It was the thickness of the walls, the alcove of the window, which was revealed. If you stopped and thought about it, it wasn't like being in a room at all. It was like being buried in a solid block of stone. But there was more than an extra chair. That distinguished this cell from the others in the same gallery. There were the privileges that went with it. For a start, there were the meals. In all the other cells, the food was the same. It was prison food. There was none of the bisto smell about it. But in the remand cell, there is no kind of restriction. You simply have your meals sent over from the restaurant opposite, or from the Ritz, or the Savoy, for that matter, if you can afford it. And it is not only a question of meals, there's the question of visitors. Within reason, there is no limit on the number of visitors a remand man can receive, and this is as it should be. A man in remand isn't guilty, he's only suspect. And he can't be kept in prison too long either. The barons had all that out with King John years ago. So there he is, the man on remand, and yet in hell, and certainly not in heaven. It's a kind of well-ventilated, carefully supervised, rather chilly limbo that he inhabits. Percy had only just seen his last visitor. It was Mr. Barks, his solicitor. He seemed a nice man, Mr. Barks. He had been picked on in court and made to represent Percy just like that. He was all right, he was. What was more, he was Mr. Barks. Oh, right, sorry, I'm just reading. I've got to remember, this is Percy's thinking going on here. I'm going to start that paragraph again. Percy had only just seen his last visitor. It was Mr. Barks, his solicitor. He seemed a nice man, Mr. Barks. He'd been picked on in court and made to represent Percy, just like that. He was all right, he was. What was more, he was Mr. Barks of Barks and Wedderburn and Barks, though which one of the Barkses Percy wasn't quite sure. Top dog of the whole lot of them, probably, from the look of him. Very much the gentleman with horn-rimmed spectacles and a watch chain and an umbrella with a gold band round it. And considering he was doing it practically for nix, very conscientious and helpful. He'd been along twice daily. He'd been along twice already, and this was his 3rd visit. The only thing about him was that he was a bit brisk. He didn't treat Percy very nice. When Percy told him, naturally, that he'd never set eyes on the Bentley that they were talking about, and that he'd brought the Lanique lady and the coach lamps, and that he'd bought... When Percy told him Naturally, that he'd never set eyes on the Bentley that they were talking about, and that he'd bought the Lalique lady and the coach lamps and the bedside rug in an all-night coffee bar from someone he didn't know, Mr. Barks had been quite rude to him. If Percy wasn't going to tell him the truth, Mr. Barks said, he'd chuck up the whole case. He was there to help Percy, he went on, not listen to a load of lies that wouldn't deceive a child. And the way he went on, you'd think that he'd got the right to speak to Percy like that. But Percy saw through him. Mr. Barks wasn't really there to help him. That was simply his line of talk. Underneath it all, he was one of them. After he'd heard Percy to the end, he said that they were going to plead guilty. And then Percy said that he didn't want to, and Mr. Barks told him, quite curtly, that he knew more about the law than Percy did. So that was that. Percy was guilty because Mr. Barks said he was. That was justice. You wait till I'm on the level with a solicitor of my own. I'll pay money. You wait till I'm on the level with a solicitor of my own I pay money to, Percy kept telling himself. Then we'll see. No more pleading guilty then. Not guilty, my lord. That's what it'll be when I've got a solicitor of my own, someone I pay money to. All the same, he couldn't help laughing. It wasn't half funny the way Mr. Barks talked about it all. He didn't say you, he said we. We were going to plead guilty, was what he said. Just as though it was Mr. Barks with his rolled-up umbrella who was pleading guilty to stealing the Bentley. Then an unpleasant doubt crossed Percy's mind. Suppose Mr. Barks were pleading guilty only because it was the quickest way of getting things done. Suppose he had said to himself, "There's nothing in it for me. Let's plead guilty and get back into the money." That wasn't a nice thought, was it? It still seemed possible that for £25 or so Mr. Barks might have been persuaded to change his plea. Percy decided to put it to him next time he saw him. He hadn't actually got the £25, but he could find it. Not that he was worrying. Lucky for him, he wasn't the worrying sort. Mr. Barks had promised to try some sort of first offenders racket that he knew how to operate. It sounded all right the way he put it. It just didn't sound likely, that was all. The funny thing was that Percy had got them foxed. From the way they behaved, you could see that they didn't know anything. They'd got him there where they wanted him, the man they were looking for, the non-stop car bandit, and they were so dumb they didn't know their own luck. He wanted to laugh at them for it. It was funny, wasn't it, when you come to think about it? In any case, I'm okay this time, he told himself. If it's a first offenders, I'm okay. And if it's 3 months, who minds that? Do it on me head. I'm okay either way. 3 months. The words came back to him as a kind of echo. Who minds? Well, there was one person who'd mind all right, and that was him. And Jackie. She'd be wondering what had become of him. She'd think that he was unfaithful or something. He couldn't bear that. Not when he wasn't. And how did he know what Jackie would be doing with herself? There was a lot of very undesirable characters around Victoria Way. She might get herself into some bad company with them. Not with him, not there to protect her. She might be unfaithful to him. That was what hurt. That was what maddened him, not to be able to get out for 5 minutes to explain. Through the iron grill on the door, he saw the blue back of a warder passing. They don't know the harm they're doing keeping me here, he told himself. I'll go after them. I'll get damages. They don't know the harm they're doing. Oh dear, sorry about my very bad reading today. It was a bit tricky. It seemed tricky anyway. Percy's doing his nut. As long as he's not barking mad. Percy's real name should be Walter Mitty. What a pity. Ah, yeah, that's it. what was his name? Danny Kaye. He played Walter Mitty in the film, didn't he? I forgot what the main title was. The something world of Walter, the crazy world, the imaginative world, the invisible, the something world of Walter Mitty. They have not linked the dead blonde with the Bentley, says Audrey. No, it seems that they, I think they have. I can't remember now how it pans out. I think they have, but I don't think they're going to charge him with that, because they always charge you with the lower offence, don't they? Because of habeas corpus or something, so that you get charged with the least offence so they can hold you. And then if you have to be released because they've got no more evidence, they then can charge you for the next offence up, if I remember rightly. Secret Life, that's it. Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Is that it? Secret Life? He just dreams of these different situations, doesn't he? Something like that. Chapter 35. I'll just try and do a bit more because I left you short-changed yesterday. I'll try and do a bit more, but for some reason, I'm just tripping over the words again. In the morning after the row, Bill's landlady took matters into her own hands and gave him notice for having a person in his rooms. Nothing like it, she said, had ever happened in any house of hers before. She spoke as though it was something which, left unchecked, would contaminate the rest of Belsize Park, spread across London, and ultimately corrupt society as a whole. They were both there when the landlady knocked at the door and delivered her ultimatum. Doris stood over by the window looking into the street and trying not to listen, while Bill and the landlady had their discussion in the passage outside. But she was too much dazed by everything that had happened to take proper notice of it. The whole of yesterday evening was tangled and distorted in her mind, as though all the brightness, the brightest colours she could think of had suddenly run into each other. It had been a slashed fork lighting kind of evening. Looking back on it, it was like an evening in somebody else's life. They left the house together arm in arm shortly after 8:30 and found a little restaurant near the underground station where they could get some breakfast. It seemed especially providential little restaurant when they reached it, because the only other source of breakfast in Belsize Park was the dining room of Bill's boarding house, and of course he wasn't allowed in there anymore. It was a pretty silent sort of breakfast, however. "I do feel awful," Doris said at last. "Your finals today, and being turned out of your digs just because of me." Bill only laughed. Today looked like the end of everything so far as he was concerned, and he couldn't take the business of the landlady seriously enough to mind about it. "Wasn't going to stop there anyhow," he told her. "Never really comfortable, you know." Then, because it was late, Doris said that she had to be leaving, and Bill insisted on going all the way with her to the office. It wasn't until he'd said goodbye to her in Clifford's Inn that he properly realised the state he was in. Here he was on the way to the examination school when he should have been composing himself for the ordeal of finals, and all that he could think about was the feel of Doris's head on his shoulder and his arms wrapped about her. It was like that too in the examination school. He found himself one of 45 young men, all about his age. The invigilator, a hushed, respectable consultant who wasn't above picking up an odd 100 guineas by marking examination papers, told them that they could all begin, and sat back in his chair on the dais, reconciling himself to the boredom of the next 3 hours. It was the 15th examination in clinical medicine over which he had presided, and it did not differ in the minutest particular from the 14 preceding ones. 2 Jews and an Indian were wearing a sort of coat and turban, a sports coat and turban. It was the 15th examination in clinical medicine over which he had presided, and it didn't matter It was the 15th examination in clinical medicine over which he had presided, and it did not differ in the minutest particular from the 14th preceding ones. Two Jews and an Indian wearing a sports coat and turban started writing immediately, as though conscious that with all the stuff bottled up in them, they were heading straight for Harley Street. And the rest read their examination papers closely and anxiously, turned over and then hurriedly reread the first side, fidgeted with their fountain pens, coughed, gazed upwards towards the ceiling, and wrote slowly and laboriously. At the end of half an hour, the invigilator, because he had pins and needles in his chair, got up and began to move about. It was then that he noticed a young man sitting towards the back who didn't seem to realise that the examination had begun. He had a vacant, moony expression on his face and was apparently drawing with the back of his nib on blotting paper. In the course of his rounds, the invigilator paused discreetly to have a look. The young man's blotting paper was covered with a dense pattern made up of 5 letters. There was Doris in large Roman capitals, in cursive script, in small italics, in high backward hand with extra serifs to all the letters, and in what looked like cuneiform. At the moment, the engrossed man was decorating the large capital D with a design of ivy and holly leaves. At 1 o'clock, the invigilator called a halt, and Bill looked gloomily at the numbered pages in front of him. He didn't seem to have written so much as some of the others. By now, the 2 Jews and the Indian had great dossiers in front of them. And that wasn't all. Bill had his own views on the quality of what he had managed to do. I only wish I knew how I'd been spending the last 5 years, he thought gloomily. I only wish I knew. He forgot his gloom, however, at the thought that he'd be last. I'm going to have to stop because I can't. I just get to the end of this section and then I'm stopping because this is a crappy end of the week. I'm enraged inside. I'm going to read that bit again I am going to stop. At 1 o'clock, At 1 o'clock, the invigilator called a halt, and Bill looked gloomily at the numbered pages in front of him. He didn't seem to have written so much as some of the others. By now, the 2 Jews and the Indian had great dossiers in front of them, and that wasn't all. Bill had his own views on the quality of what he had managed to do. I only wish I knew how I'd been spending the last 5 years, he thought gloomily. I only wish I knew. My chair is sinking. What is my chair sinking for? This is ridiculous. He forgot his gloom, however, at the thought that He forgot the gloom, however, at the thought that he'd at last be able to phone Doris. Sorry, I'm having to really concentrate. I'm going to stop because we'll pick that up next time. I'm sorry about that, but I'm actually having to look at each individual word and I cannot scan a line without making any sense. So I apologise for that, ladies and gentlemen. But it's a very good book. It's Good Friday. It's not been a good reading day for me, but we will get back to normal on Monday. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch up with you next time. Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye for now.